Okay, yesterday we went through the problem of foreknowledge and free will. And I promised I would do it again because it's a complicated problem. First I'll read to you how the Rambam describes the problem, and then we'll meditate on that a little bit to be sure we understand what the problem is. And then I will tell you, as I did yesterday, the solution that others have to the problem, not the Rambam's position. And then I'll explain to you why the Rambam doesn't accept their position, and then I'll tell you what he says about the subject. So, the Rambam says, I'm rough without this. Shema Tomar, perhaps you will say, or lest you say, HaKadosh Baruch Hu Yodeya Kol Ma Sheyeh Kodem Sheyeh. Hashem knows everything that will happen before it happens. That's called foreknowledge. Knowledge before of what happens later. Now, that's true. I want to ask you, if it goes down to every detail, Yoda Shezeh Tzadik, or Russia, or Lo Yoda, does his knowledge of the future include free human actions? This person, let's say, was born yesterday. Does Hashem know whether he will become a tzaddik, whether he will become a Russia, righteous or wicked? Does he know that? And now, Im Yada, if you tell me that he does know, because you believe that God's knowledge is complete, it's perfect, without any failure, Im Yada Shehu Yeh Tzaddik, if he knows that this person is going to be a tzaddik, I Efshar Shelo Yeh Tzaddik, that it will be impossible that he shouldn't be a tzaddik. Now, you might try to get out of this by biting both ends of the bullet at the same time. V'im Tomar, and if you say, Sheyada Sheyeh Tzaddik, yeah, God's knowledge is complete. He knows what will be in the future. Particularly, he knows this person is going to be a tzaddik. But even so, Efshar Sheyeh Rasha, it's still possible that he should be wicked. Hare lo yada hadavar al buryo. Then it means he doesn't have complete, perfect, absolute, necessary, infallible knowledge. His knowledge is somewhat speculative. His knowledge is somewhat tentative. If there's still a possibility that the person will become wicked. So if you're going to credit God with absolute, perfect, necessary, infallible knowledge, then once he knows he'll be a tzaddik, he can't be a rasha, he can't be wicked. In other words, free will seems to mean that I have at least two alternatives, and I have control and power over the alternatives. They're both within my power. Which one happens depends upon my choice. It's my choice that makes the difference. That's the way it feels, that's the way it seems to me that free will works. And now the critic says, well, if you believe in a God who knows everything, including the future, then that picture is impossible. Because if he's faced with a decision between A and B, now let's imagine in the real world he does A, and that means that yesterday God knew he's going to do A, then it won't be possible for him to do B. Because imagine doing B, if doing B would mean to contradict God's knowledge. Yesterday God knew he's going to do A. If you do B, that means you're going to make God's knowledge yesterday false. That can't be. God's knowledge is absolute, necessary, infallible, perfect. So there can't even be a possibility of doing something against his knowledge. So, once you put into the picture that God knows things that before they happen, and he knew yesterday that, let's say I did it today, and I did A, that I was going to do A, then I'm not facing two possibilities, two alternatives, both in my power, both under my control, and I decide between them. That's not what's going on. Because the one I didn't choose isn't really possible for me. That's the way the Rambam sets up the problem. Notice that the problem is only that His knowledge yesterday that I'm going to do A today knocks out B. His knowledge yesterday that I'm going to do A today doesn't force me to do A, push me to do A, cause me to do A. His knowledge doesn't cause anything. His knowledge doesn't force anything. His knowledge is totally passive. From the point of view of this problem, he's an observer. He's outside the system. Not doing anything. It's just that. Yesterday, knowing that I'm going to do A means that doing B is off the page. It's impossible. The knowledge yesterday that I'm going to do A deprives me of the other alternatives that I didn't choose. It deprives me of that, which then it cancels the picture that I had two alternatives, both under my control. That's the problem of foreknowledge of free will. Yeah.
So what is the word that we would be trying to express the Hashem's knowledge? What is the word in Hebrew?
Yada.
Yada?
Yud Dalet Ayin. Yada.
Like with that, right? It's really,
I'm sorry?
it's like that.
It's like what?
Like that?
I don't know the word you're saying. That?
That's.
Das.
It's like that. It's like that, right?
Das is a word without an ayin in the middle, and it means
yeah.
religion or something. You mean da'as, da'ir, alan,
Like in the
al
back
itself.
of the-
But you have to say da'as.
That.
Yeah.
It's like that.
That's right, same verb.
That's-
Same verb, same shorish. Same root. Yeah. And that's the word that the Rambam uses here.
Yes, that.
And the Rambam wrote this text in Hebrew, so that's where the the other books he wrote in Arabic. That's why I'm saying that. Here's not a translation. He chose that word himself. Okay, so that's the problem. Now, I'm going to tell you a solution that isn't the Rambam solution. And I'll tell you why he didn't use it. I want you to know that there is a logical solution to the problem. The key move that the critic makes is this. We have a picture where yesterday God knew that today I'm going to do A. We ask, could I have done B? And we say, well, compare the possibility of doing B with his knowledge I'm going to do A. And then you get a collision. But now we should ask the critic, why should we make that comparison? Why should I compare the possibility of doing B with God's knowledge that I'm going to do A? After all, in the real world, I did A and he knew A. That's a consistent picture. You're asking about something that didn't happen. You're talking about something that didn't happen. Is it possible? And by the way, there's nothing mysterious here. We do this all the time. When somebody did something and we say you did something wrong, he says, what should I have done? And, well, you should have done this, which didn't happen. But you're talking about what could have happened. You're talking about another virtual history that could have happened. So here, I'm moving from the real world in which I did A and God knew A, and I'm saying, well, what about a virtual world in which I do B? Is that really a possible world? Who says you should keep God's knowledge constant moving over to B? Who says you should take God's knowledge of A from this world and put it into the virtual world also? Who says you should do that? In particular, not just who says you should do it, but I'll give you a reason not to do it. Suppose God knows what he knows by tracking what happens. God tracks what happens perfectly. If he tracks what happens, and I imagine a virtual world in which I do B, then in that world he knows B. He doesn't know A, he knows B, because he never makes any mistakes. So if I do B in that world, then he's going to know B in that world. And then there's no problem. The critic makes his case by invalidly, by falsely transferring God's knowledge yesterday I'm going to do A into the virtual world. He has no right to do that. Now, if you want a model of how this could possibly work, the first thing to think, and I said yesterday, this is the name of Lahavdil Bertrand Russell, who actually did say it. Imagine that God gets his knowledge of what I do by observing me. He watches me and sees what I do. And by the way, the language in the Talmud, and Talmudic sages, of God's knowing the future is vision. Sofa ma'asehim shel tzadikim. He observed the actions of the righteous in the future. Hakol tzafui v'reshus hasun, it says the Mishnah. Everything is foreseen and yet free will exists. The language of the Talmudic sages is that God sees the future. I think that's very indicative. I think it's very good for this solution. So, in our world, I do A. God observes me do A. That's how he knows that I do A. In the virtual world, where I do B, God will be observing me, and he'll be observing me doing B, and he'll know that I do B. And there's no problem at all. You see that what the critic did was falsely transfer God's knowledge of A from the real world to the virtual world and create a contradiction. But he has no right to do that. That is a solution to the problem. Yeah.
So, if we put aside the scenario in which the critic was trying to hold God's absolute knowledge into the possible world, which, as we've seen logically, it's not viable, because
it's not a question of possible knowledge. It's not a question of complete knowledge. It's a question of this particular item of knowledge, this particular one proposition that he knows. He knows I'm going to do A. It's transferring that one proposition that's the problem. Not transferring God's knowledge or his powers or his abilities or possible or impossible. The problem is transferring this one item. I'm in the real world, I do A and he knows A. I'm building a virtual world. I started that virtual world by saying I do B. And the question is, well, am I going to get into trouble? Is there difficulty? Some kind of contradiction there? Right? And the question is, how shall I continue to build that virtual world? What else should I put into that virtual world? The one that didn't happen. The one that isn't real. What shall I put in there? The critic says, put in that he knows A. Really? Why should I do that? Just to make trouble? How about in the virtual world where I do B, putting in that he knows B? Who told you what to put in? The critic has no way of forcing me to put in that he puts that he knows A. So by doing that, he's making a move for which he has no justification, and that's the fallacy in the proof. Yeah.
I have a question. It's related to something you said last class about how God can't do anything that's not morally perfect. I had a question.
Okay, but before we go into that, let's just finish with this. Okay.
Sure.
Yeah, let's just finish with this. Yeah.
So, if Hashem foresees the future, and he supports, gives, and creates you all the time, where is this is the question, because I really don't see a place in which you can actually fit a free will into the frame of God's absolute knowledge. I just don't see it in the frame of the knowledge. I don't see a way to frame free will.
So you have to ask the question, where does God's knowledge come from? I think you're starting from a different place. You're starting from a place where God's knowledge is independent, absolute, disconnected, given, fixed, and untouchable.
And where does it come from?
Right? If you start that way, there's no solution.
Right.
The solution here is is a picture of God's knowledge where he gets his knowledge of what I do from my doing it. That's where he gets the knowledge from. So then when you change what I do, of course his knowledge will be different. One way to put it is he perfectly tracks everything that happens. But in a world where something different happens, he knows something different because he perfectly tracks everything that happens. Right? He misses nothing, makes no mistakes. So if I say, in this world I did A, what about a world in which I did B? It follows immediately that in that world, he'll know I do B. He doesn't make any mistakes. He gets everything right. Yeah.
Would this view have to hold that the future actually exists?
I guess it'll be a question of how you construe God's knowledge. It's a tricky question. I mean, I know that relativity theory is presented that way. Einstein was supposed to have understood it that way. When he was coming close to dying, he said, we physicists know a secret that no one else knows, that none of this is real. The things are all planned out beforehand, and we're just, But by the way, physicists haven't bought that, because consciousness it belies that picture, and they realize they can't put consciousness into their picture, and they're not willing to simply turn their backs on consciousness. And Brian Greene talks about this, and others talk about it. It's not so simple to make a worldview out of that picture. At any rate, so if you allow that his knowledge is dependent upon our action, there's no contradiction. And I said yesterday, because I took this from the Rivash, that the move that some people want to make by putting God out of time doesn't help. Putting God outside of time doesn't help, doesn't make any difference, doesn't change the dynamics at all. Now, I got an email from somebody, I guess, or maybe he saw it on the recording, and he's a little confused about this. So let me just say a little bit more about this. I'll explain why it doesn't help, and then I'll explain where a person could become confused. Let's say God's outside of time. If God's outside of time, don't use verbs. Verbs are past, present, or future. They're tensed in English, and then you have to talk about when it was, and so forth and so on. So let's talk about God's knowledge as a noun. There's a thing called God's knowledge, the set of all things that he knows. Now, there are two possibilities. Either what he knows outside of time depends upon what I do, or it doesn't. If it depends upon what I do, we have exactly the same solution. In the real world, I do A. Outside of time, God's knowledge includes my doing A. New possibility, hopefully. Another world in which I do B. Well, what will God's knowledge in that world contain? It will contain my doing B, because what it contains depends upon what I do. And then there's no contradiction. Other possibility, God's knowledge outside of time doesn't depend upon me. I don't make it happen. It's not tracking me. It's not relevant. It doesn't pick up its content from the world. Right? So then, in the real world, I do A. In the real world, he knows that I do A. Now I move to this possible world, and I say, in this possible world I do B, but God's knowledge, which isn't sensitive to what I do, isn't the result of what I do, isn't affected by what I do, so it stays the same. Then you move it over to the possible world, and it is knowing that I do A. Then you have a contradiction. The whole analysis turns on whether God's knowledge is the result, a reflection of what I do or not. That's the only issue that determines whether you have a solution or you don't have a solution. That's what I learned from the Rivash. Now, let me just say this one thing, because this is, I think people get confused here. When you say that God is outside of time, what you should mean is that no time words, time concepts, time descriptions apply to God. All time talk is off limits. I got someone sent me this question where he said, well, if God's outside of time, then for him, everything happens at the same time. Everything's simultaneous. No, that's not right. Because at the same time and simultaneous is time talk. It's words that come from time. It's words that apply only to a dimension in which there is time. If he's outside of time, they aren't simultaneous, and they aren't before and after, and they aren't all together. They're just facts that he knows. All time talk is out of bounds. So people talk this way, but they're making a big mistake. There's not simultaneous. There's no time talk at all. He got himself into a terrible bind by thinking that way. Yeah.
Wouldn't then saying that God created something, wouldn't that imply that the time as an act of making something, we think of creation as like a time relation?
No, because the time there will be the time of the creature. When a thing outside of time relates to a thing in time, that relationship can be dated by the thing in time. And that's a standard move. Yeah.
So, are we saying that the only way to continue with the idea of free will is by saying that God's knowledge is dependent of?
Oh no, it's not. This is not the only way to move forward. Because I said there are two ways to handle it. One is this answer, and then the Rambam's position. We haven't looked at the Rambam's position yet. There are two ways to go forward, as you say. One is to accept the solution, and accept that God's knowledge depends upon what we do. But now I'll come to describe to you what the Rambam says about this, and you'll see what the alternative is. The Rambam will not allow that God's knowledge depends upon what we do. This is my observation. I'm quite certain that it's correct, but I didn't see it anywhere, so I'm just identifying it as such. In the Guide of the Perplexed, Maimonides says at least 5 times that God is not subject to his pa'alus or he pa'alus. He pa'alus means being affected by. And he explicitly says that it's not only a matter of change. You might assume that if A is affected by B, that must mean that A was in a state, and then after being affected is a different state, so he must have changed, and you don't want God to change. No, that's not the end of the story. It's not just change. It's the mere fact of being affected by. So you could imagine that A and B have a relationship, and A is having an effect on B, always has been, is, and always will be having the very same effect. Then there'll be no change. It's still outlawed. It's still outlawed. He will not accept that for God at all. Well, here, if God's knowledge depends upon my action, if it's my action that determines what knowledge he has, that is he pa'alus, that is his being affected by me. And the Rambam is against that. So the Rambam is not going to buy this answer that I told you. And I mentioned yesterday that in Part 3, Chapter 17 of the Guide of the Perplexed, Maimonides there, among other things, is examining two famous schools of Arabic philosophy, their ups and downs. And at one point he writes, this school of Arabic philosophy believes that God knows the future and also that man has free will, and a little thought will enable you to see that that's an absolute contradiction. And leaves it at that. It's a contradiction. So the Rambam does not believe that this problem has a solution. Nevertheless, he raises the problem here in the Mishnah Torah, and he says something about it. Now, I'll read you what his words are, translate them for you, and then we'll have to talk about what he's saying. Da Teshuvah she'ezu arukal me'eretz midah v'rachava min hayam. Should know the answer to this question is wider than the earth and deeper than the sea, broader than the sea. There are many great principles and mountains of ideas and information that are hanging on it. You have to know the following that I'm going to tell you. I already explained to you earlier in this work. Bedea shehi chutz mimenu. God does not know via a knowledge that is external to him, adjacent to him, attached to him, artificially applied to him. God does not know through a knowledge that's external to him. Kibnei Adam, like people. People know through a knowledge that's external to them. He doesn't know that way. People, shein v'da'atam shnayim. For people, the person and his knowledge are two. Elohu yisbarach shemo, but rather God, v'da'ato echad. He and his knowledge are one. Ve'ein da'ato shelo adam yichol la'asig davar zeh al boyo. This fact, that God and his knowledge are one, is a fact that human logic cannot appropriately understand. Ukashem she'ein koch ba'adam la'asig v'limtso amitas habori, just as a human being cannot understand the nature of the Creator. Shinama kilo yirana adam v'chai, man cannot see me and live. Kach ein koch ba'adam la'asig v'limtso da'ato shalabori. Just as we can't understand God's nature, his absolute essence, his identity, his reality in total, so we also can't understand his knowledge. Now, that's not a big surprise, since he just told us that he and his knowledge are one. And if A and B are one, you can't understand A, presumably you can't understand B, because A and B are one. That's not a big deal. Right? It's not a big jump. So if he and his knowledge are one, and we know that we can't understand what he is, who he is, his essence, identity, so for sure we can't understand his knowledge. Isaiah said, your thoughts are not my thoughts, and my ways are not your ways. V'kivan shekain, ein banu koach leida he'eich yoda HaKadosh Baruch Hu kol abrim u'maseihem. We do not have the power, the ability to know how he knows all the creatures and their actions. That's what he says. Now, there's a little bit that needs to be untangled here, and a couple of questions that need to be answered, and I think we can get a picture, and then we can understand what it tells us about free will. Let's start with the nature, the essence, the being, the identity of God. When we say that that's beyond our ability to understand, what we mean is, you can't talk about it. You can't say anything about it. You can't describe it. Our concepts don't apply to it. So when you aim at that target, you end up with nothing. You come up completely empty-handed. Now we're being told that somehow his knowledge and his identity are one. So then we'll have the same result. You aim at his knowledge, you miss every time. Nothing you can say about it. Nothing you can describe it with. No concepts apply to it. So then there ought to be nothing that you could say about it. Now you may ask, now wait a second, Rabbi, just a second. You're talking about his knowledge, hey? Knowledge? Knowledge? Isn't that a word? Isn't that a concept? Isn't that a description? If you're talking about his knowledge, you ought to be able to say that it's knowledge. How can you say you can't say anything if you're talking about his knowledge? The answer is that we aren't really talking about his knowledge. What we're talking about is this. This I have in part from my oldest son, who has taught me a lot of things. If I would simply decide, since God is beyond understanding, I'm not going to talk about him, then I wouldn't say that he knows. I wouldn't say anything about him. Would that mean that he's ignorant? Doesn't have knowledge? No, because ignorant is another human description. I wouldn't be able to say he knows. I wouldn't be able to say he's ignorant. I wouldn't be able to say anything, positive or negative, nothing, zero. But now, there is something that we could say, and that is, he can do everything that knowledge would enable someone to do. He's not less than having knowledge. It's not that he's inferior to someone who has knowledge. He can do everything that knowledge can enable one to do, but not with knowledge. He does it some other way, by some other capability, some other capacity. Let me give you an example of what I mean. Imagine a science fiction story. You get into a time machine and you go back 200 years. You take with you an MP4 player and miniature speakers, and you're talking to people, you can communicate. And then you say to them, I have something to show you. And you set up the player, and you push the button, and it's playing violin music. So they look at you, and they look at this thing, and say, hey, you got to tell us how you did that. You say, what? How did you get the guy in the violin into that little box? How'd you get him in there? A human being in a box playing the violin? How's that possible? So you say to them, there's no person in there playing the violin. Oh, listen, you can't fool us. We know what that sound is. That's the sound of a violin. There's only one thing that makes that sound, a person playing a violin. We just want to know how you got him into the box. So I think what you say to them is, listen, there's nobody in there. I can open it up and show you. It's violin music, but it's coming out of there in a way that you can't even imagine. You can't even imagine why violin music is coming out of the box when there's no person with a violin playing it. Because you don't have enough concepts, you don't have enough knowledge to understand the description. If I had a year to talk to you and bring you up the last 200 years of science, I could probably put you into a position where you can understand. But right now, it's something which you can't understand. So, we can get violin music without a violinist in it. Now you tell me, but some violinists have to be played to be recorded? No, it's a synthesizer. It's done electronically. It has all the tonations of violin music, but not made by a violin, made by a synthesizer. So, we say that I can't talk about God. I can't talk about what he is. But I can say that there are no limitations of what he can do. I don't know how he does it. I don't know what he is, but I see the things that he does. He created the world, and he causes miracles in the world. So what we say is, he can do everything a knower can do, but he doesn't do it with what we call knowledge. He does it some other way, in a way that we can't understand and we can't describe. That, I think, is what the Rambam is saying here. You have to give up describing what God is altogether. That he says explicitly. He says it in Yeshivat Ohr, he says it in the guide in many chapters. So, once you say that, here's how we look at free will. Where did we start from? We started from the idea that there's a collision between free will and God's knowledge. The way of dissolving the problem is stop talking about God's knowledge. Leave that one out. Then there's no collision. Because we can't talk about God altogether. So one thing we can't do is talk about his knowledge. And when Maimonides uses the phraseology, we don't know how he knows, and it sounds like we're saying he knows, my son suggested that what he means is, we don't know how he has the capacity to do everything that knowledge would give you, even though he doesn't have knowledge. He has something else, something that's superior to knowledge, and that enables him to do all of these things. Now, the collision for free will is not between free will and his ability to do lots and lots of good things. The collision is between free will and knowledge. That's where the contradiction comes up. It says we're not going to talk about God's knowledge anymore. You can't raise the problem. Now, a solution to the problem is what I call a dissolution of the problem. You're dissolving the problem. You put yourself in a situation where you can't raise the problem. And that way, there's no contradiction to free will at all. That's, I think, the Rambam's attitude towards this problem. Question before I go on to elaborate on this a little bit? Yeah.
So, well, I suppose this might be the next step, but then under what conditions we would say, since Hashem's ways are superior to everything that would apply in terms of knowledge, that is the place in which he would be able to enable free will. That's all we can say, so to speak. Like since
I'm not following you at all. We're not going to talk about his knowledge at all. If you don't talk about his knowledge at all, there's no problem to be solved.
Right.
I don't need a special place. It's not limited in any way. There's nothing to talk about. It's just free will. That's all there is.
But I mean, just to see if I feel didn't we say that all what knowledge enables to a person
Yes.
and more
Yes.
would be all easily said, like, so there's a way to dissolve the problem.
I said everything that knowledge enables a person to do, not to be, not to understand, not to picture, to do actions. Your actions should be actions that are appropriate to everything that happens, right? That's what you use knowledge for, right? His actions are appropriate to everything that happens, but not by knowledge. It's not by knowledge that he does it. Does it some other way. There are two ways to predict, let's say, the stock market. One is to know economics very, very well, and the other is to manipulate it, to make it, right? Put in the investments and program the CEOs and make it happen. That way is not through knowledge at all. It's through power, through control. So I'm not saying that that's how God does it. I'm just saying that that's a different concept altogether. It's a different concept altogether, right? Yeah.
So would it be possible to conceptualize of the way that we view, I guess, what we're calling God's knowledge, and as a way to understand it?
So again, the words on the page are, God's knowledge is identical to his being. It's one. And just as there are no words to describe his being, so there's no words to describe his knowledge. Now my explanation of those words, the kolomar, is God has the powers that knowledge gives, but he doesn't get those powers from knowledge. He gets it from something else. Let me give you another example. Maybe another example will help. I have an adding machine, right? So you put it in two numbers and it gives you the sum. So somebody says, I wonder how that works. I know how I add, and I have an algorithm. I have a routine, line the numbers up. If it's more than 10, carry it over to the next column, and so forth and so on, right? But there are different ways to do it. I wonder how this does it. Then you look up the program and you find out it doesn't do it at all. It's a lookup program. It has a memory of a chart with one number, and then at the cross point, the sum, and it just looks it up. It's a lookup program. There's no algorithm at all. Oh, so although it's giving the sum of the two numbers, it's not adding them. There's no addition going on. It's just a lookup program. Well, that's a very different way of getting the sum. Right? If you didn't know about that, you'd think, well, it must have, and if they're big numbers, it does it very fast. No, it's just looking it up. That's all. The size of the numbers makes absolutely no difference. You take the horizontal column and the vertical column, and you find the box, and there's the answer. So that would be a way of getting the answer utterly different from what we do. Utterly different. We understand the algorithm, we apply it step by step, we carry the numbers over, add them up according to the rules. There are no rules there, just lookup program. That's the idea that something's going on. It'll give you the right answer, but in an utterly different way. Okay, now, some people object that this is a cop-out. Listen, Rabbi, you're really stuck. You don't know what to do about foreknowledge of free will. So you create this idea we can't describe, we can't understand, we can't conceive. You take refuge in mysteries, and that's intellectually bankrupt. It's a cop-out, and it's something that no respectable scientific mind would ever do. We never. That's religion. Religion is just a hopeless, anti-intellectual cop-out. I think that's very short-sighted and ignorant of the way science works. Science is in that situation a lot of the time. What makes stars shine? Go back 200 years, and then keep going back for thousands of years. Did anybody have a clue? Did anybody have a hypothesis? Did anybody have a method of investigating it? It was just an unknown. It's real, isn't it? The stars do shine. And we knew very well that we don't know why they shine. And we don't know how to know why they shine. Okay, we think that we found the answer of nuclear fusion, and maybe it's right. But for thousands of years, no one had a clue. That didn't make it unscientific. Beyond science, just a matter of subjectivity, just a matter of feeling. Let's take an up-to-date example. There's a well-known philosopher who wrote a book, Consciousness Explained. One of the other philosophers who wrote a review of the book in one of the philosophy journals said a better title for the book would have been Consciousness Ignored. Because in 350 pages, he didn't talk about the subject. What do you think those two philosophers agree on? The guy who wrote the book and the guy who criticized the book. Just about nothing. They can't agree on what the subject is. They can't agree on whether he talked about the subject or didn't talk about the subject. Does that mean there's no subject? Does that mean it's all fictitious? Does that mean it's an intellectual cop-out? It means we just don't understand it. That's what it means. We really don't understand it. And then read what all the quantum physicists say about understanding quantum mechanics, why things do what they do, how things do what they do. The motto for many physicists, shut up and calculate. Forget about that. You're not going to understand it. We have rules for calculation. We can predict what's going to happen. Why and how it happens that way? It's something which is utterly, utterly mysterious. And by the way, should someone tell you this is the wave-particle duality, it's not so mysterious, not so difficult. In certain experiments, light behaves like a particle. In other experiments, light behaves like a wave. That's not so difficult. Well, the person who told you that isn't a physicist, and he's ignorant. It's not true. Because in exactly the same circumstances, light behaves as a particle and as a wave, and no one can explain why that should happen. It's exactly the same circumstances. I'm taking this from Richard Feynman's lectures on physics, which is famous, and every good exposition of quantum mechanics has this. So to say that acknowledging human lack of understanding, acknowledging human ignorance or inability to describe and conceptualize is a cop-out, that's where science is a lot of the time. Now, the fallback position of the critic is to say, I agree with you, there are things we don't understand, and we're honest enough to admit that we don't understand them, but we don't draw a line and say you can't understand them. All right? That is a difference. Let's see how significant a difference it is. Are you going to tell me, Sir Critic, that your position is that we can understand all of them? How would you know that? What makes you think that the human mind is correctly configured and oriented to solve every problem, to understand everything there is to understand? Why would you assume that? On the contrary, my assumption would be that some things are very complicated, and you have a measly 86 billion neurons. Okay, it's not really true, because now they've discovered that glial cells also participate in information processing in the brain, and another 86 billion glial cells. So really you have 176 billion that are doing the job, but still it's a finite number. And it's quite reasonable to think that there are propositions about the universe that are more complicated than you have storage to understand. Why would you think that everything's understandable? I think your attitude ought to be maybe yes and maybe no. Maybe all the interesting things to be understood, human minds can understand, maybe they can't. So you too admit there can be things beyond the mind. So the only difference between your position and our position is we say, here's one. And you'd rather say, let's keep working on it. Okay, that's the difference. I don't think it's a big difference. It's not an intellectual cop-out, especially when it's coming from a source. But as any critique, that's what the critique is limited to. That we say this is one that isn't going to be understood, and you would rather keep an open mind and say, let's keep trying. Okay. I don't think that's a severe, intellectual critique. Yeah.
Wouldn't it seem to be the case, though, that our beliefs are somewhat like truth tracking, and that whatever it seems to be, whatever is true, we should be able to have a belief representation of?
Not at all. Truth tracking. First of all, to be truth tracking, you're presuming that you have a given body of concepts with which to create propositions that could be true or false. But what about realities that can't be described in your set of concepts? Your set of concepts just aren't capable of describing them.
What reason would we have to believe that those realities exist?
The reason is that the history of science shows us that there were ones which our sets of concepts up to that time couldn't describe. And that's why we have conceptual revolutions, because the concepts were not good enough to do it.
Paradigm shifts.
Paradigm shifts, exactly. There was a time when science was defined as the study of cause and effect, which means an event that takes place in the world without a cause was beyond the conceptual ability to describe. All of a sudden, in quantum mechanics, you had to change your conceptual basis. So, since we know that our concepts weren't adequate to handle that reality, so it's a fair option that the concepts that we have can't handle a certain reality, and it could be that we can't evolve the concepts because our minds don't work that way. Right? There's a limitation. We are based on these five senses. There are other things to which we have no natural sensation. Ultraviolet light, magnetism, radioactivity, right? None of those things can we sense. A being that could sense those things would perhaps have a different conceptual structure from ours, and would be able to think of things that we can't think of. There's no reason to think that our minds have universal capacity. Yeah.
So, you mentioned I remember there is the idea that when there is an object that observes the behavior of light, it behaves like a corpuscular behavior. And when there is not object, so there is they already have the experiment or the scenario in which all the conditions were exactly the same. This is what you mentioned, and I would be fascinated to see
Okay, so I've done this, and it's commonplace. The two-slit experiment. In the two-slit experiment, you fire a photon or electron or whatever it is, right? And when it leaves the thing that generates it, it's a dot. And when it arrives at the other end, at the photographic plate, it's a dot. But in between, it behaves like a wave, because the distribution of dots is a signature of a wave phenomenon. So it's one experimental setup, one experimental result, but there's dot, dot, and in between there's wave. All going on at the same time. So don't tell me it's dependent upon different setups. Right? It isn't. It's the same setup, and there's wave and particle going on at the same time. Nobody understands how that could be. Nobody understands what makes that happen. It just happens, that's all. A very good book about this is called Beyond Weird by the British science writer, oh man, what's his name? You can Google it. Beyond Weird is a very excellent exposition of quantum mechanics. For the layman, without any equations, just what the concepts are, where they come from, and how they interact, and what the problems are. Yeah.
Can I ask my question from
Yeah, you can. Yeah.
So I had a question about like the idea that Hashem can only do what's morally good because of his nature. So we know that the Torah is morally perfect, and we know that Hashem didn't put anything in the Torah without a reason. So does that mean that the Torah, that Hashem couldn't have changed the Torah if he wanted to?
No, because the reason why some of the things in the Torah are morally perfect is because he makes them so. It's not that they're independently moral, and he's like an encyclopedia of independent moral facts, but he makes them so. For example, he says, if you do X, Y, Z, then I will respond by causing the world to develop in a certain ideal way. Now, he could have decided to make the world develop in an ideal way on the basis of other actions. So it is his response to it makes it moral, because if you do this, you get a response of the world developing in an ideal way, but it only develops that way because he decided to make it develop that way when you do this action. So they're not independent moral facts. His relationship to the world makes them into moral facts. That would mean that he's not, it's not dictated that he couldn't have made the Torah different.
How do we know what in the Torah is moral facts and what is things?
So in terms of what he does and what he tells us to do, they're all moral facts because we have a moral relationship with him. This is something which is grossly ignored. I grew up Reform, and that one of the many fallacies in Reform was to ignore the fact that you have a moral relationship with God. Turns out that eating pigs for a Jew is a moral crime. Putting on tefillin for a Jew is a morally good action, because you have a moral relationship with the one who told you to do these things. So all of it is moral. Okay, today's what? Today's Tuesday? I'll see you tomorrow.